Hello and welcome everyone to our Vistatec Life Sciences in Focus webinar, talking all about real-world evidence. My name is Karen Tkaczyk and I'm your host today. And I will let our esteemed panelists introduce themselves in a moment, but first some housekeeping. You have access to the chat. Feel free to tell us where you're logging in from and connect with the other attendees there. We will have a portion at the end of the webinar with Q&A from the audience, so please put your questions for the panel into the Q&A tab in Zoom, which I suspect you're all familiar with by now. If any of you need accessibility, you can turn on captions, again, using the Zoom Zoom control bar. So our format today is that we're going to have a short presentation to frame the topic of real-world evidence, and then we're going to move into Q&A. So before we go into that presentation, let's ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Heather, welcome.
Hi, my name is Heather Colvin, and I'm the Director of Evidence and Outcomes Policy and the Global Regulatory Affairs team at Johnson & Johnson MedTech. I'm super excited to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and mostly Estelle's presentation.
Lovely. Dan.
Hello, my name is Dan Stevens. I'm a fellow in the Global Advocacy Group at Boston Scientific. I focus on real-world evidence, patient science, and clinical trials. And today I'll be sharing my perspectives and my thoughts on real-world evidence. These do not necessarily represent the thoughts of Boston Scientific, but are my own. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Estelle?
And I'm Estelle Frappé. I'm based in Paris, French, as you can hear. I'm a former director of real-world evidence for medical device and diagnostics at Aetion, and I'm speaking for myself as well as Dan for today. I'm very happy to be there with you.
Very good. So thank you again all for being here. Estelle, let's dive right into the meat.
I will share my screen right now. Okay, so I will start with a short introduction on real-world evidence, on global regulatory landscape and innovation. And I love to start this kind of presentation with a quote of Jeff Shuren, the director of Ph.D., who says 1 year ago, I wish we could get rid of the term real-world data and real-world evidence. We were an early adopter of that at the FDA, and it's become a 4-letter word. At the end of the day, we are talking about clinical evidence, and it says everything. For a long time, real-world evidence and real-world data were not really considered, especially for medical device and diagnostics, as clinical evidence. And now, since the last 5 years, I would say, it's more and more the case, and it's more and more adopted, and we are now talking really about clinical evidence. So regarding health data, if we consider health data, we can see that health data come from a variety of sources. But all the time, health data are data coming from the patient. So they can come from the patient through different channels, the providers or the patient-generated data. If we talk about the providers, health data can be collected in a primary care physician office, through a specialist, through urgent care, emergency room, hospitals, labs, and pharmacy, and can be generated through electronic health records, lab results, charge masters, medical devices themselves, or as you can see on the right, through insurance provider and generate claims, whether they are open or closed. And on the bottom of this slide, you can see that also patients can generate their own data through digital therapeutics, for example. Wearables like your Apple Watch can generate real-world data. Applications and social media as well, and also through patient registries directly. So it's really a a great variety of sources that form the basis of the real-world evidence usage and adoption. And I would like to thank thank the publication and all the contributors to the publication who developed this very interesting chart. And Dan, we have the chance that Dan participates into this publication, so maybe he can say a word later on this very interesting publication. As you can see on this one, it's really the usage and adoption of real-world evidence. You can see on the middle, you have the real-world evidence and real-world data that is there to inform real-world evidence. And real-world evidence can be used in different aspects of the health product life cycle. So for the pre-market authorization, for indication, or label expansion, or study design, for example. In a post-market setting, when it's required, by the regulatory agencies, like post-market safety requirements or effectiveness, or if it's voluntary on post-market research, to product development and research to inform strategy and execution. Also, it can be used in for the economic analysis when you need to ensure that your product has the right effectiveness in its area. For reimbursement, because some HTA agencies across the globe request very strong analysis, very strong cost effectiveness analysis to make sure the reimbursement is adapted to the product, and also for public health surveillance. So it's really, the adoption is really in both areas, so for regulatory decision making, and also for all the, not all, but most of the business processes across the product, the healthcare product. And now moving on to what is real-world evidence. So real-world evidence is the clinical evidence derived from analysis of real-world data. So if we look at the FDA definitions that have been published in 2017, so real-world data are data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And if you go to some examples, you have data derived from electronic health records for claims, billing data, but also from product and disease registry, from patient-generated data, including their in-home use settings, and data gathered from other sources that can inform on health status, such as mobile device, or so on. And if we go to the FDA definition of real-world evidence, so real-world evidence is the clinical evidence. So once again, we're talking about the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of real-world data. So this is the regulatory definition from FDA. In other countries, there are some other definitions that almost say the same, but these ones are really clear and really show what is real-world evidence. And if we go to real-world data, so we talk about where real-world data can come from, but there are different levels. So there is a patient level, the medical professional level, healthcare institutions level, and country level. So if we talk about patient level, so as we say, patient generate directly data in electronic medical records, consumer data, mobile devices, and social media. If we go on the medical professional level, they can generate patient pathways and also primary data collection through clinical trials, for example. If we go on the healthcare institution, you have all the claims data that are generated by healthcare institutions, the administrative data, and the cost studies. And on a country level, you have the device product registries, the disease registries, and also the mortality databases that exist on a country level in different countries. So really, data can come from almost everywhere at each level. And now moving on to the real world adoption for medical device across the globe, because teachers, industry adopting real world evidence and recognizing real world evidence as clinical evidence. But we are not only focused on the US. And this map shows that, of course, on the left side, you can see that US FDA and MDIC have published a lot of documents related to real-world evidence for medical devices, but they are not the only ones. All across the globe, we have an increasing adoption of real-world evidence. So on 2017, FDA was really initiate, I would say, the publication on the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. So it's an interesting and still up-to-date document published in 2017. On 2021, the FDA prioritized 2 guidance documents on post-market surveillance and post-approval studies that include, of course, real-world evidence. Again, in 2021, there was an action plan initiated by FDA again on AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning-based software as a medical device. In 2022, the MDIC published the external evidence method framework, also very interesting and very informative. In 2022, the post-market surveillance under Section 522 was released, and in October 2022, the procedure for handling PAS imposed by PMA application order was also released. And there were some publication some updates in 2023 also, and it's an ongoing process at FDA and across the globe. There are some examples. It's not exhaustive, but it's just to show you the adoption. As you can see on the right side, in 2019, Saudi Arabia SFDA published a very interesting guidance on medical device post-market clinical follow-up studies. In 2020, it was also guidelines for software medical devices have been released in Singapore. In November 2020, China NMPA released the technical guidelines on real-world data used in medical device clinical evaluation. And it's also linked to their ANAN project, which I recommend strongly to look at. In March 2021, the Japanese MHLW released 2 guidance, one on the use of registry data in a regulatory submission, and the second one on guidance for reliability of registry data. Also interesting. In Europe, in the middle of the slide, you can see, so everybody knows that the EU MDR was enforced in 2021, in May 2021. And also in June 2021, the French HAS, which is the HTA body, released real-world studies for the assessment of medicinal products and medical device, so including medical device. And on a more global point of view, you have in July 2020 the update of the ISO 14155 2020 on clinical investigation of medical device, which now applies also to post-market studies. In 2029, IMDRF published different documents on clinical evaluation and clinical evidence, and also on registries and registry linkage. So in a nutshell, we can say that now real-world evidence for medical device is adopted across the globe. Now it's adopted. There are some nice publications, but it needs to be developed and to be used because it's not used enough at the moment. And now some examples, concrete examples on what can we really do with real-world data, real-world evidence in different aspects. So first, if we go to the R&D side, in the clinical trial optimization. So for a long time, clinical trials and real-world evidence was considered as opposite. But now we have, well, not now, but we have developed some projects and some ideas have emerged to inform and to optimize clinical trials through real-world evidence. So now they are not opposite; they are very linked. So for clinical trial optimization, real-world evidence can inform on the identification of the best sites and the most appropriate patients, and also to support protocol design and feasibility, and to also adjust the protocol on during the clinical trial to provide optimized amendments. We can leverage also real-world data to build a comparative arm. So country allocation, site and patient selection can also be informed through real-world evidence. In terms of epidemiology assessment, which is the base of real-world evidence, we can monitor the pathology evolution and the therapeutic strategy by understanding the burden of disease and the natural history of the disease, to characterize patient population, but also to identify subgroup of interest that have not been identified at the beginning, to understand treatment pathways, to determine the standard of care, identify unmet needs, also identify local comparators, and not only the ones that you have, the global one, the patient flow analysis, adherence studies, and off-label use, which is very interesting as well. In terms of product safety and risk management, real-world evidence can support to segment, analyze, and assess the safety and risk benefit of therapeutic intervention in a real-world setting by through signal detection, early signal detection, safety surveillance, vigilance, risk assessment, but also in mandatory settings for post-market clinical follow-up and label extension. If we go on the health economics and market access side, you can, through real-world evidence, can help demonstrate the product value for optimizing the pricing, the reimbursement, and the coverage potential. So through some different studies, like a cost of illness, burden of disease, budget impact, outcome studies, comparative effectiveness, compliance and persistence, contract optimization, and target population. And if we go with the commercial analytics, which is also important in for a company, you can diagnose, plan, forecast, and track brand performance, and also characterize and assess the size of the target market for the from the disease and treatment pattern perspective. So by supporting the planning and strategy for launch, for example, forecasting, to run diagnostic, to assess performance, to split by indication, and to ensure also the contract compliance. So now we have seen that real-world evidence can be used in different departments and for different aspects of the product lifecycle. But real-world evidence can also, and it's all linked, can also meet and need to meet multi-stakeholders' needs. So from regulators, so once again, regulators will ask for a product, the detection and the assessment of safety signals. This can be done through real-world evidence. To inform on product safety and performance, and to ensure safety requirements on post-market settings, for example, during the product lifecycle. For payers, real-world evidence can determine the value and coverage, and can support the monitoring of the usage within specific criteria that are developed by payers. For physicians, real-world evidence can support decision-making by developing decision trees, for example, and therefore improve care and inform on a real-world treatment alternative. But also real-world evidence can inform patients and advocacy groups to help them understand treatment, perceive risk and benefits on a real-world setting, and not only during the clinical research on a very small group of patients, and also can outline the patient experience through patient-reported outcomes, for example, or patient survey. And for the industry, so it's also very interesting to first meet safety, performance, and effectiveness commitments and requirements, to validate the value of the product, to inform the reimbursement again, and to develop publications that will support physicians and patient and advocacy groups. And I have finished with this introduction. Thank you very much. And I hand over to Karen.
Thank you. Well, that was thought-provoking, right? So let's start. Dan, Heather, would you like to respond to something that Estelle has opened up with? What's top of your mind?
I can jump in here, Dan, and then you and I can tag team. So I think a lot of the things that you covered, Estelle, thank you so much for the great presentation, really kind of highlight kind of the technicality of it. But I want to take a step up and talk about the why are we doing this in the first place? Because I think it's really important for us to stay grounded in that what we're really trying to do is improve the quality of evidence we have about the patients we are seeking to serve. And we need to be innovative as new innovative approaches are becoming available to us. So the ideas around real-world evidence are not new ideas. We have traditional studies, case reports, case series, independent investigator-initiated studies. We have this history of using a variety of mechanisms to get this information or to try to get this information. What's new is potentially our ability to get access to this data more easily because it's being digitized. So I think one of the things we need to take a step back and saying is, one, our ultimate goal to better serve our patients by having better evidence is the baseline foundation of the work we're doing. Two, the idea is, I agree with Jeff. I always hated the term real-world evidence, but it's what we're stuck with now. Is that what we're really talking about is innovative ways to get to that clinical evidence and to go beyond kind of the traditional mechanisms that we've had in place and use the technology we have available to us. So it's really about capturing the full patient experience. And I really loved what you talked about and like the chart where you talked about where it fits into kind of the various product life cycle. It's about the total product life cycle. It's in identifying that unmet medical need, innovating in that space, also looking at how our products are currently being used in a clinical setting to see what we can do to refine. Do we better understand risks associated with those products and also potential benefits? Because we know that a lot of work is happening in the clinical setting that goes beyond what the clinical trials traditionally can do. And that's another important point. We need to really focus on beyond the traditional clinical evidence or profiles, because we all know the limitations of the current clinical trial setting. Limited in scope, limited in populations, controlled for some of the things that we will see in a real world setting. We're going to see complex patients with many comorbidities. We need to be able to reflect that information as we learn. So that's kind of one step. And two, I loved the guidance document piece that you have in there because it is exploding. We see guidances just in 2023. Korea released an updated guidance for their real-world evidence. The US released an updated guidance for their real-world evidence. TGA in Australia released their first ever guidance around real world evidence. And then we see other groups like Singapore and the UK recognizing real world data as a source of clinical evidence. So not specifically real world evidence guidance itself, but the recognition of real world data as a source of clinical evidence. And so that's kind of where I'd like to start. And I'm going to bat this back to Dan with actually a question, because I know this is a place where both of us feel strongly about is these guidances don't happen within a silo or shouldn't happen within a silo. And let's talk about those collaborations that inform and shape guidances moving forward. So Dan, I set it up for you. How's that?
Thank you so much, Heather. Perfect. I agree with everything that Heather just mentioned about the importance of leveraging the digital tools that we have and the data and the tools we have to get to the data. And Estelle, thank you very much for that outstanding overview. One of the other pieces that I'd bring to your attention is how many of the dates that were listed on the map that Estelle showed are within the last 3 years, and all of them are within the last 7 years. And so this, to echo again what Heather said, this is rapidly evolving and currently going on a global scale. But as Heather mentioned, these guidance documents come out in draft form typically and are submitted to the public for comment. And this is a very important place for all of us to participate and to collaborate. And so one of the papers that Estelle referenced was published in Endovascular Today, and it was about a landscape of global regulatory policy documents on the use of real-world evidence. And this manuscript was published through a public-private partnership that was managed by the Duke Clinical Research Institute that involved a variety of industry stakeholders as well as regulators and academics. And two of the co-authors on the manuscript are from the FDA, who came in and did a survey of guidance documents across the country, across the world, and using industry perspective of just what is available and how these could be leveraged, and then identifying some overlapping areas. But this collaborative community is tremendously important to advancing regulatory science and to advancing the harmonization of guidance and regulations across the globe. In a perfect world, we will be able, and we'll get to a point to where we'll be able to collect data and seek approval across multiple geographies to help patients throughout the globe. And as we continue to evolve to that end, I really encourage all of us to consider how we're participating in that effect, how we're participating in collaborating to raise the tide that will lift all boats. This is an outstanding opportunity for us, and we're at a very unique time in the evolution of medical device and treatment to be able to contribute to that.
I also want to tag on to that because there are multiple organizations, multi-stakeholder partnerships that exist, and some of those are being funded by the regulators and health authorities themselves. So we've had that long history of multi-stakeholder partnerships in the US with the National Evaluation System for Health Technologies, which fielded a number of pilots, which helped inform the most recent guidance that was released by FDA at the end of 2022 or 2023. What year is it yet? I can't even remember. But also, we have partnerships, harmonization by doing out of Japan that has been foundational for many years in advancing the use of not real-world data, but registry data to support regulatory decision-making. And that includes the Japanese regulators, the FDA, and industry, clinical societies, etc. So this multi-stakeholder partnerships exist out there in multiple jurisdictions. In China, for instance, they have the Boao pilot zone, which is funded by the government, but also allows industry to partner to do pilot real-world evidence studies. And a number of studies have been done under that pilot zone. Additionally, the EU's Innovative Health Initiative is funding a series of projects, one of which is IDERA, which I'm involved with, full of transparency, which is looking at the integration of heterogeneous health data, which is clinical trial data and real-world evidence or real-world data, to support regulatory and HTA decision-making. So there are a number of these public-private partnerships that exist out there, and it's the importance of our engagement and participation in these sandboxes is really important.
So you've beautifully covered the idea of efforts towards global harmonization from a geographic standpoint. What about from a therapeutic standpoint? We have uneven adoption of the principles of real world evidence, right, across therapeutic areas. Heather, you want to talk to that one? You look like you might.
I think what we're finding, if you just look at the 2021 report that was issued by FDA that included 90 examples of submissions that the FDA identified real world evidence playing a significant role in. We do see that the vast majority of those cases come out of the cardiovascular space. But when you think about it, it's obvious why. One, it's an acute area where there's high risk, potentially high benefits for patients who don't have other therapeutic options. That's critical, like the ability to kind of provide better information in a high risk area. And there are a lot of registries that exist in that space that are expansive registries that enable that. Alternatively, and we have these partnerships between the clinical societies, regulators, thinking about the TAVR example, the ever touted TAVR example. I think it is uneven adoption in other therapeutic areas because there hasn't been the urgency around it. Where, let's take orthopedics, for instance. That is an area where we have lots of registries. And a lot of those registries are being used for post-market surveillance, post-approval study, follow-up, that type of information. But we don't see them being used in the pre-market space. And so I think what we need to do is sit down with the regulators and identify what are the underlying challenges there for them and an acceptance of that data for pre-market. And how do we work collaboratively to fill the gaps? So we know, for instance, that radiological imaging is a challenge in the orthopedic space. How do we identify mechanisms to provide better data in that gap area? So I think we see this uneven adoption, but I think it's driven by kind of the different evidence needs. And I would take this back to Estelle. One of the key things that we keep talking about is fit for purpose. Not all evidence, not all data is appropriate to all different studies. And it does have this feel of we'll know it when we see it, but that is becoming more refined as we go. So thinking about that, Estelle, like you showed that great map of all the different data sources. And the truth is we have to be able to sit down, look at those different data sources, characterize them in the context of the study question and the proposed methods to determine if they're fit for purpose for a regulatory grade study. So I'd love to hear more from you, Estelle, on that.
Yeah, what is high quality data, Estelle?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. That's the question, I would say. Yes, you say perfectly. It's when you have a lot of data, of real world data coming from everywhere, from every settings, every country, and so on. And when you have a question, a regulatory question, or a specific question that can be informed through real world evidence, the first question needs to be, what is the data that I want to use fit for purpose for this research question, in terms of quality, in terms of completeness, because you need to have some information in your data set to answer the question, not only not only because the data set seems to be the right one. Has the data been collected properly? Does the data respect HIPAA and GDPR, for example, the data protection, data privacy laws? Is the population in line with the population I want to study? Because if you look at a data set coming from, I don't know, from Romania for a product to inform a regulator in the US, there might be some discrepancies because the patient will not be the same, the standard of care is not the same, the products on the market are not the same, the way the patients are treated are not the same. So there are a lot of questions that need to be asked prior to run a real-world evidence study with real-world data. And this goes through a very strong gap analysis and real world data assessment, because sometimes you will need to use multiple data sets to answer one question. And each time you are buying a data set, or you are developing your own real world data sets, your own registry, I would say that it's important to ask yourself the right question prior to use or to develop it, and also to optimize the process. Meaning that when you are an industry and you develop, you want to start a registry, think always that your registry for a specific question, like for post-market safety requirement, for example, think that maybe your registry could be used, your data could be used for other questions. Because it's always better to add one or two questions, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, in a data collection, than to come back to the physician twice or 3 times or 4 times for on the same product, to say, oh, I was looking for female and now I want to look at male. So it's been 6 months between the two research. So it's a lot of time. It's a lot of money, and everything needs to be optimized at the very beginning. And it starts with a good gap analysis and a great real world data assessment prior to going directly to answer the research question.
Okay, thank you. What about data sharing networks, Dan? That's an area that you care about, right? And it follows on naturally from what Estelle just said.
It absolutely does. Thank you, Karen. So one of the challenges we have with real-world evidence studies is, just as Estelle mentioned, is collecting a sample size that is that we can actually get to an appropriate sample size to analyze. So for instance, when we talk about doing real-world evidence studies, we typically are looking at very large registries, coordinated registry networks, networks of data where data are shared. And one of the things that's very important is that they have common data dictionaries, common terms, data that we're able to search in a very consistent manner to be able to identify the patients of interest and the products of interest. So as a quick example, there was a study that was published in October of this last year in the Journal for the Society of Angiography and Interventions that looked at therapies that are used to treat pulmonary embolism. It's called the REAL PE study. And in this study, this was through a large data network, and we started with 340,000 patients in this publication, and to get to 1,200 patients that were actually analyzable and met the criteria for the study. And so when we start thinking about real-world evidence and gathering data to analyze, to answer a clinical question, we typically have to start with a massive initial sample size in order to get to an analyzable sample for the data that are fit for purpose. I know Heather has a really good example of this from work that she's done with the NEST Coordinating Center. And so I'll ask Heather to kind of share her insights on the study that was done with by J&J.
Well, thanks, because I think we have a couple of examples, and I think it's almost as important to know what doesn't work as to know what works. And I think your point around being able to get to a sufficient sample size to provide statistically valid information is really critical. So one of the test cases, as many of you may know, there was a series of test cases that were piloted through the NEST data network, with the idea that we were going to pressure test, could they answer these types of real questions that industry had or clinical societies had. So one of those was in the pediatric space. And even though we had a series of pediatric hospitals that were included in that network, ultimately that study was not completed because we were not able to get to the sample size. So as much as we are trying to address these big data sets, your point is really important, Dan, is that sometimes you just cannot get sufficient numbers for it to be valid. And so we need to figure out, one, how to expand those data sets to capture those really hard to study populations, because those are the populations that are hard to study in traditional clinical trials as well. You know, we're thinking about pediatric populations, rare diseases. I know that one of the comments that just came up was talking about that the 29th is Rare Disease Day. And we really see real world evidence as one of the tools in the toolbox to help support better evidence generation in the space of rare diseases. But sample size is always going to be a problem. So that's the lessons learned. That doesn't mean we can't do it in those spaces. It's that we have to look at linking diverse data sources, identifying patients across different spaces to get to that sample size. So that's one of the technical challenges that we continue to face in those hard to study groups. So that's the lessons learned space to develop and grow. On the other side, J&J initiated a study under the NEST test cases looking at cardiac ablation. We had a product that had been on the market for paroxysmal AFib, but we knew it was being broadly used based on anecdotal information in persistent AFib. So we were able to, working collaboratively with NEST, the various NEST data network partners and the FDA, develop a robust clinical evidence study using only real-world evidence from 3 different sites that we were able to get an indication expansion for persistent AFib based on that data from those 3 different sites. But it took 5 years of consistent work collaboratively. Now, the goal is that the next study won't take 5 years, but we had to do this in, working together and in collaboration to address those challenges along the way in order for, one, all of us to feel comfortable with the process, with the data and the quality of the data that provided meaningful results. And so we ultimately did get PMA supplement approval for that. So there are lessons learned. We should be sharing those lessons. I know NEST was sharing a lot of that information. FDA built that into their new guidance document, the lessons learned over the last 5 years. So I think that data linkages, various diverse data partners are going to be critical if we're going to address the challenges you bring up, Dan, around sample size.
All right, one more from me before we turn to the audience questions. So I see a couple have come in, but please do add to them, our attendees. So the work that we do at Vistatec often advances diversity by means of language and culture. So how are regulators and companies encouraging or ensuring varied, diverse, or representative data for their various therapeutic areas, various needs? Anyone want to tackle that? Heather, your hand is up.
You go, Dan.
So thank you, Heather. I'll be brief, relatively speaking. At Boston Scientific, we've had an initiative called Close the Gap that's been in place for 20 years. And this is a program that Boston Scientific initiated to address health equities in specific cardiovascular disease states, both through race, ethnicity, and gender. We've been looking at health equity issues for quite a while in a very focused way, and have been also working with different publicly available information to identify areas with social determinants of health that can impact public health problems, and also to increase enrollment of various diverse or underrepresented populations in our clinical trials. This initiative has, and Close the Gap, I would love to think was sort of a tipping point to what's happening now globally, but that's probably not the case. But we're seeing a tremendous amount of attention being paid to health equities, health inequities, and underrepresentation. And this is a fantastic thing. We've seen draft guidance documents issued by the FDA. We've seen position statements issued by IMDRF regarding health equity. We're seeing this more and more around the globe. And it's not simply it's not simply a question about inequity, but it's also a question about appropriate treatment of patient populations that may respond differently to different devices and have a better outcome or a worse outcome. And so this is not only an area that needs to be explored and addressed from a societal problem, it's also an area that needs to be explored and addressed from a public health problem. And so with that being said, we have to address this. We have to fix this problem, that the issue of underrepresentation and health inequity, to have a just society. And I'll turn that over to Heather. Thank you very much.
I think that, I love the example. Thank you, Dan. And I think one of the key things that we're looking at is, you mentioned the draft diversity plan guidance that was issued, and that we're waiting for the new draft diversity plan guidance that was required by Congress out of the omnibus bill. So any day now, I'm hoping we'll get to see that new draft diversity plan. But it specifically requires companies, as part of their clinical research, to develop diversity plans about, one, outlining step number one, what is your burden of disease in diverse populations? Two, given that demographic and socioeconomic information, how are you translating that into recruitment and retention mechanisms that will ensure a representative population included in your clinical studies? And then the follow-up with potentially monitoring this in the post-market space. Now, initially, that guidance was very focused, the original draft guidance was very focused on race and ethnicity, but it has been expanded to include other factors, as well as sex and age and other factors that are really important. So, we have also been working in this space for a long time. We have our My Health Can't Wait initiatives that are really looking at community engagement. As part of that community engagement, we're hearing from different groups about the things that are potential barriers in terms of location of clinical sites. Is it urban, rural? How do we get more diverse populations in terms of the location? How do we address issues of language and cultural competency in our recruitment mechanisms and retention mechanisms? So there's a number of efforts that are underway to help us improve that. And I think we all recognize that that is a journey we need to continue. But I think that these individual initiatives by different companies are important. But again, we see the importance of collaborative communities. Yeah. Many of you might be familiar with MedTech Color, which is been recognized as a collaborative community that is also working in this space and has put out a number of kind of tools and best practice documents that I would highly recommend you look at.
Estelle, would you like to speak to that, or would you like to tackle the question on AI that we see from our panelists? I bet you want the AI question, don't you?
I will just add a comment to say that diversity and representativeness of diverse community is very important, and I wish that in the future we will have this in Europe, as you can start develop it in the US, because in Europe, regarding the different privacy law, it's not, for example, it's not allowed to collect the race and the ethnicity of patients, and this is really a problem because we have Europe is big, is large, and I wish in the future we will have this. So that was just a comment.
So I'm curious to know if AI is being used to collect and analyze collected data at this point. If so, how? And how is it regulated now? And do you foresee that changing in the future? So I think that's one for you, Estelle, isn't it?
A little bit. So yes, AI is being used to collect and analyze data and to extract actually information from social media, from publications, from studies, study data. And it is started to be regulated. We have the AI Act that has been released recently. I think it was 1 or 2 months ago. So yes, we start to regulate it, but AI, as everybody knows, is exploding. It's a fast-growing area. incredibly fast growing area of, and we are a little bit lost because AI represents or include a lot of things that can be assessed, regulated, and some others that emerge when you regulate one thing, the day after you have another one that improve or change totally the first one, and you have to re-regulate it. And basically, the regulation is not as fast as AI developments are. So, nevertheless, it is used, start to be used, start to be regulated, start to be accepted by the regulators across the globe, and across different agencies. And yes, of course, it's in the future we will use more and more AI, especially for to augment a population, for example, for rare disease or pediatrics, because AI can inform also in this area. It can be very interesting, but it's an evolving process, and I can't wait to see what will happen in the future.
I think
Heather, Dan, do you want to
say
speak
about
to that?
Is that I think that there's a lot of complexity in the AI space, and I think what we're hearing a lot about right now is generative AI, which is a whole nother set of issues. And so what we do see, like with software as a medical device, and where we do see AI being used, it's a closed loop rather than this generative AI that we're seeing. But there are examples, even in that case of 90 examples that FDA had of de novo approvals or grants that are use what we would call AI, but it is in that closed loop version rather than the generative AI, which I think is an important clarification.
Thank you for that distinction. All right, I have one here. So we will all remember the issues and the subsequent regulations regarding lack of reporting of unsuccessful clinical trials, right? We all remember the shift and all that happened around that. Do you think, so where are we on reporting of unsuccessful RWE submissions evidence? Where is that going? Is that something that you think will be regulated and that people will be required to submit everything right from the start? Did we learn from the clinical trials scenario, or any other thoughts on that?
I would just want to step in and take a step back. So what we have in the clinical trial space are these mechanisms of trust. We have a process. We have, publicly posting of protocols. We have a clear and developed over a period of time because of abuses, kind of mechanisms of trust that are built into the clinical trial system. What I would say on the other side is that those research practices, good clinical practices, we need a corollary in the real world evidence. We need something that aligns with good research practices within the real world evidence space, which are not going to be the same as what you see in the clinical trial space. But I think there's clearly, when you look at all the guidance documents that exist out there, there are clearly the foundations of what we would see as good research practice, a priori posting of protocols, so that we really address upfront the issue of data mining concerns, which are real concerns that regulators and HTAs have. That they're just going to go in there, we're going to grab a data set, we're going to run it 15,000 ways and come up with a solution that gives us the best results for our product. So that can be alleviated by creating these transparency and trust mechanisms. And I think that's a space where I'm very excited to see some of the things that are coming out and really would support that transparency and trust development.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree completely with everything Heather said. And also, the identification of endpoints is always super critical in any clinical trial, in any clinical evidence pursuit. And the identification and the definition, how you define the endpoint, how you measure the endpoint, is just as critical in real world evidence and the outcome of the analysis that you perform. And so when we look at how the application of real world evidence and how the analysis strategies are continuing to evolve, this is an area that will continue to see more growth, publication, position policy papers, collaborative communities, all of these contributing to this area of increased adoption of this science.
Very good.
So looking
like
at that issue of the kind of conceptual definition versus how it's translated in real world evidence to the operational definition. And I think that is a place where we as a broader community can start sharing that, because if we can get broader acceptance of those operational definitions, like how that actually plays out in the codes, I think that's going to be important.
Right, the best practices, the establishment of best practices in the domain, specific to the domain. Very good. Well, we are approaching the top of the hour, so I should invite, what would you like to say that you haven't said yet? So is there something you'd like to say that you haven't, something you'd like you'd like to remind our audience of?
So I'll just real quick go first. One of the things that I'd just like to bring up is real world evidence starts out pretty messy. This is the scope of the source of data that we're collecting. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge that's well worth investing in and exploring. It's a challenge that we all need to get better at, because it provides us a tremendous opportunity to improve healthcare globally. It also gives us the opportunity to address equity issues that may not be able to be easily discerned otherwise. And so I just want to encourage the audience and anyone else to continue the work, to continue developing the science that we all will benefit from.
And if I may, my last comment would be and I will jump on what you said, Heather and Dan. Transparency is really the key for the acceptance of real-world evidence as clinical evidence, because if you are transparent from the very beginning, from the protocol and the data collection to the publication of results, it will bring trust more and more to real-world evidence.
I'd like to take it back to where we all began with, like, a focus on the patients and seeing them as people in this process and seeing them as partners in our research rather than data generators. We need to shift our focus around patients and people to see them as partners in research.
Well, I can't do better than your three closing comments. Yes, thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been, I'm sure it's been enlightening for all those people watching who know they don't know as much about real world evidence as you experts that have joined us. So I'm sure everybody here is appreciating that. And I thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, for sharing. It's been a great pleasure to enjoy this conversation with you. And in closing, I will say, so thank you very much. And thank you to our audience. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Life Sciences in Focus from Vistatec. And in closing, there's a survey. And among other things, it asks if there are any other topics, what other topics you'd like to hear from us in our future webinars. So we would love to hear your input on that. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a great pleasure.